I always believed photographs were anchors to memory, little frozen moments that told the story of who we were, where we belonged, and who loved us. As a child, I loved staring at the photo albums my mother kept in the tall oak cabinet in our living room. Their leather covers embossed with golden lettering, the smell of glue and glossy paper drifting up whenever a page turned. Back then, those albums felt like proof that my life mattered, that I was part of something larger than myself. But it wasn't until I grew older, until one rainy, suffocating afternoon when I found myself alone in my parents' house with nothing but the sound of dripping water against the windows, that I learned photographs could also lie. It began innocently, almost sweetly, as I sat on the carpet of my childhood home while my parents busied themselves in the kitchen, preparing tea and pastries for my visit. I reached into the cabinet for the thickest album, one I hadn't looked at in years. The leather cracked beneath my fingers as I pulled it free, and with a nostalgic sigh, I opened to the first page. There they were, my parents, my brother, my sister. Christmas morning, when I was 6, paper torn across the living room floor, lights twinkling behind it. Everyone is smiling, caught in that timeless glow of the holidays. Everyone except me. At first I chuckled to myself, thinking perhaps I had been the one behind the camera that day. But as I flipped to the next page, then the next, my stomach tightened. Every single photograph, holidays, birthdays, summer vacations, told the same story. I was absent. My brother's 10th birthday party, the one where I vividly remembered helping my grandmother carry out the cake. I remembered the candles, the song, the way the icing smeared across my dress when he playfully shoved the knife into my hand and told me to cut the first slice. But in the glossy photo before me, my brother was front and center, knife in hand, my parents flanking him proudly, my sister clapping by his side. Me, nowhere. I frowned, my mind racing back to my 9th birthday, the one when I wore that ridiculous pink crown my grandmother insisted on buying for me. I remembered standing in the center of the table, cake before me, candles glowing, my family chanting as my cheeks burned with both embarrassment and delight. I remembered the frosting that smeared across my nose when my father leaned too close, making everyone laugh. I remembered because it was mine. It was one of the few moments I had ever felt like the focus, like the star. But when I turned the page, I felt the blood drain from my face. There was the same cake, the same candles, the same pink crown, except perched on my sister's head. My brother stood in the middle, holding the knife, the frosting dabbed on his nose, while my parents leaned in as though they were admiring their perfect, beloved children. I wasn't there. I had been erased. My hands trembled as I closed the album, then opened another, desperate to prove to myself that I was imagining things, that maybe my memory had twisted details over time. But album after album told the same sickening story. Vacations to the beach, where I remembered building sandcastles taller than myself, showed only my brother and sister smiling with shovels in hand. Family hikes where I had twisted my ankle climbing the rocks, yet insisted on reaching the top, showed my siblings triumphantly raising their arms beside my father, with no trace of me in sight. Even the school concerts, the ones where I remembered standing in the back row in an itchy costume, singing nervously while my mother waved from the crowd, now depicted my siblings surrounded by classmates. My space in the row conveniently filled by another child. It wasn't just a missing face. It was deliberate, thorough. They hadn't simply chosen photos where I wasn't present. They had taken photos I remembered being in and had removed me. I could almost see the faint traces, the way a background blurred unnaturally, the edge of an arm that looked too stiff, the slight warp in the shadows. Someone had cut me out. Someone had deliberately painted over me, as though I had never existed at all. My throat tightened, my chest aching as though I were being hollowed out. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, pounding against the glass, echoing the chaos inside my head. I shoved the album shut, my heart racing, but some sick part of me couldn't stop. I needed to know how far it went. I pulled another album from the bottom shelf, this one thinner, newer, from my teenage years. I opened it and froze. My high school graduation. I remembered the day vividly, the sun scorching above us, my hair sticking to my skin beneath the stiff cap. I remembered clutching my diploma, tears burning my eyes as my parents smiled with pride. Pride I thought, at the time, was for me. But the photo before me showed only my sister holding a diploma, her gown slightly ill-fitting, my parents beside her. I stared at it, my pulse pounding, because I remembered wearing that exact gown. I remembered it hanging loose at the shoulders. I remembered that moment as my triumph, not hers. But in their version of history, it was never mine to begin with. My legs felt weak, and I dropped the album onto the floor, my breath ragged. The sound echoed through the house, and within moments, my mother appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a towel, her face tightening when she saw the open pages sprawled across the carpet. "Why are you digging through those old things?" she asked, her tone sharp, defensive. I pointed at the album, my voice cracking. "Where am I? Why am I not in any of these photos? I was there. I remember." You cut me out!" My mother's eyes darted to the album, then back to me, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw guilt flicker in her gaze. But it vanished quickly, replaced by that cool, dismissive smile she wore so well. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. You always looked so awkward in photos. We just cleaned them up a little, made them nicer." "Nicer?" I whispered, the word bitter on my tongue. "You erased me. You made it look like I was never even there." She rolled her eyes, tossing the towel onto a chair. "Honestly, you're overreacting. They're just pictures." My father passed by then, glancing at the scene with disinterest, his face unreadable as he muttered, "Leave it alone. It's not important." But from the corner of the room, I caught sight of my brother and sister lingering, their smug expressions cutting into me like knives. They knew. They enjoyed it. As if by erasing me from the photos, they had finally won the unspoken war for my parents' approval. My entire body trembled, my vision blurred with tears I refused to shed in front of them. I couldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, I gathered the albums, shoved them back into the cabinet, and forced myself to walk away, though my insides screamed in protest. I needed air. I needed space to breathe before I suffocated. As I passed my parents' study, something caught my eye, a crumpled scrap of paper near the trash bin. I don't know why I bent down to pick it up, maybe some instinct, maybe desperation for proof. When I unfolded it, my breath caught. It was a piece of a photograph, torn unevenly along the edge. On it was my arm cut off at the shoulder, the sleeve of the dress I remembered wearing on my 9th birthday. They had literally torn me out of my own photo and thrown me away. My fingers clenched the scrap so tightly it wrinkled in my hand. Proof that I wasn't imagining it. Proof that I wasn't delusional. Proof that I had been erased. I stuffed it into my bag before anyone could see. That night, as I drove home through the rain, the windshield wipers struggling against the storm, my mind spun in circles. I stared at the scrap of photo every time I stopped at a red light, the jagged edge whispering to me that my existence had been treated as disposable. But beneath the grief, beneath the hollow ache spreading in my chest, one question burned hotter than all the rest. Why? Why did my family feel the need to pretend I never existed? Why did they rewrite history to exclude me, to crown my siblings in my place? The betrayal cut deeper than any wound I had ever known. It wasn't just about pictures. It was about my very identity, stolen and replaced. And in that moment, gripping that scrap of paper like a lifeline, I swore I would find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. After that day in my parents' house, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't even think straight without the images of those altered photos clawing at my mind like ghosts that refused to be buried. I would lie in bed at night staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional passing car outside, and I would wonder if I had somehow imagined my entire life. If the laughter and warmth I remembered had only ever been fabrications my mind created to protect me. If my parents had never loved me in the first place, and I had been fooling myself with memories that no longer matched the evidence. And in those long, sleepless hours, I began to doubt the very fabric of my reality, asking myself over and over whether those smiles in the photographs had ever been genuine, or if they were just masks my family wore until they could finally erase me completely. The paranoia ate at me until I realized that if I didn't act, if I didn't seek out something concrete, I would drown in uncertainty. So I began to dig into the fragments of my past that still remained untouched by my parents' rewriting of history. And the first person I turned to was the only one who had ever looked at me with true softness in her eyes, my grandmother. She lived only an hour away, in the small, crumbling house with faded wallpaper and a garden overrun with weeds that had once been her pride. Though her memory had grown fragile with age, her heart was still stronger and kinder than anyone else's in the family. So I drove out there on a gray Saturday morning, the weight of those albums pressing on my chest like a stone. When she opened the door, her wrinkled face lit up in recognition that nearly undid me with relief. We sat together in her kitchen, the smell of chamomile tea steeping in chipped cups between us, and after a long silence in which I tried to steady my trembling hands, I finally asked her the question that had haunted me since I discovered the truth. "Grandma, do you remember me? As a child? Do you remember those times we spent together? Because the photos don't show me anymore." Her brow furrowed, and she reached across the table to place her thin, cool hand over mine. "Of course I remember, sweetheart," she said gently, her voice quivering but certain. "You were always such a bright little girl, always asking questions, always laughing. Do you remember the trip to the lake? You caught the biggest fish anyone had seen that day." My throat tightened so hard it hurt. Because yes, I remembered that day vividly, the sun glittering on the water, the way my arms ached from reeling the line, the pride in my chest as everyone gasped at the sheer size of the fish, nearly bigger than I was. And yet, in the albums at my parents' house, that moment no longer existed, at least not with me in it. "I remember," I whispered hoarsely, "but there's no photo of me there, not anymore." My grandmother blinked at me, confusion etching across her features, and then she slowly rose from her chair, her slippers shuffling across the linoleum floor as she disappeared into her bedroom. I waited, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears, until she returned a few minutes later with a dusty cardboard box tucked under her arm. She set it down on the table, coughing at the cloud of dust it released, and began rummaging through its contents: old letters, faded greeting cards, Polaroids bent at the corners, until finally she pulled out a photo encased in a cracked plastic sleeve. And when she handed it to me, my breath caught in my chest so violently I nearly sobbed. There I was, a little girl beaming with triumph, clutching a massive fish with both hands, my hair sticking to my forehead in damp strands, my cheeks flushed with joy, and right beside me stood my father, his hand on my shoulder, and my brother with his arms crossed, glaring in the background because he hadn't caught anything that day. It was exactly how I remembered it, unaltered, untouched, real. My hands shook as I traced my own smiling face in the photograph, the proof of my existence, the undeniable evidence that I had been there, and suddenly, the truth crystallized in my mind with brutal clarity. It had never been about clumsy poses or messy shots. It had never been about aesthetics or cleaning things up, as my mother claimed. It had always been about erasing me from the narrative, about transferring my accomplishments, my moments of triumph, my very identity, to my siblings so they could shine as the golden children, while I faded into nothingness. The photo burned in my hand like fire, both vindicating and damning, and I knew then that my family hadn't simply cut me out of pictures. They had stolen my childhood, stolen my proof of existence, stolen the very history that defined who I was. That night, when I returned home, I spread out everything I had gathered so far across my bed. The torn scraps I'd rescued from my parents' trash, the fish photo from my grandmother's box, the haunting memories in my mind, and I began to piece together the puzzle of my stolen life. One by one, I compared the originals with the altered versions I had seared into memory from the albums. The birthday where I wore the pink crown, but my sister now wore it in their photos. The graduation gown that had hung on my shoulders but somehow now wrapped around my sister in their version of events. The family trips where I had stood in the center but was now replaced by my brother, their faces glowing with pride in places where I once stood invisible. The more I pieced together, the deeper the betrayal cut, until it felt as though my very skin had been flayed and I was nothing but raw nerve endings, exposed and aching. And in the silence of my room, surrounded by evidence of my erasure, a dark determination began to take root inside me. They thought they could rewrite history. They thought they could cut me out, tear me from the narrative, and leave me wandering the world like a ghost of a daughter who never existed. But they underestimated me, because I was still here. I still remember, and now I had proof. I swore in that moment that I would not let them get away with it. If they wanted me gone, I would return louder than ever. If they wanted me invisible, I would make myself seen by everyone. I would dig, I would uncover, I would expose, and when the truth came to light, they would regret ever trying to erase me. The betrayal burned inside me like fuel, feeding a fire that I knew would only grow stronger. As I lay awake that night, staring at the photo of me and the fish pinned to my wall, I whispered to myself a vow that I intended to keep no matter the cost. If my family wanted me to vanish, I would come back louder, stronger, and with the truth in my hands, a truth they would never be able to erase again. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about violence, screaming matches, or tearing down walls with my fists. It wasn't about the kind of cinematic explosions I used to imagine when I was younger and angrier. It was about truth, about unearthing what had been buried, about holding up undeniable proof against the faces of those who thought they could rewrite reality and convince the world that I had never been there, never smiled, never succeeded, never mattered. And so I began to build my case piece by piece, night after night, scouring every corner of my past for fragments that remained untouched. My apartment floor covered with scattered photographs, clippings and yellowed envelopes that smelled of dust and time, as though my very existence had been buried in a coffin and I was slowly digging it up again. I visited my grandmother again and again, gently coaxing more photographs from the depths of her boxes, each one a jewel of evidence, each one a reminder that I had once stood proudly in the center of moments my family had stolen. I contacted old friends from school through social media, asking if they had kept any photos from our class trips, our concerts, our silly afternoons in the park, and to my amazement, many of them did. Grainy snapshots where I was clearly there, standing shoulder to shoulder with them, my hair tied in the same sloppy ponytail I used to wear. My smile nervous but real, my presence undeniable. Even the old photography studio at the edge of town still had archives from years ago, negatives that bore my face in stiff school portraits where my parents had later replaced me with my sister in the glossy frames that lined their walls. Each discovery was like a match dropped into the darkness of my despair, illuminating the truth with an intensity I could no longer ignore. And as the pile of proof grew higher, so did my resolve. They had erased me in their albums, but I would carve my image into something far greater, the memory of the world itself. I started small, careful not to overwhelm, testing the waters with a single post on social media, side by side. I uploaded the doctored version of my 9th birthday photo, the one where my brother wore the crown that I remembered, and the original, rescued from my grandmother's collection, where I stood in the middle, cheeks flushed, crown tilted awkwardly, frosting on my nose, laughing so brightly you could almost hear the sound through the picture. My caption was simple, almost heartbreakingly so. This is what my family did to me. They tried to erase me. At first, nothing happened. Just a few sympathetic likes from friends who probably thought it was a silly family quarrel blown out of proportion. But then someone commented, "Wait, that's insane. Why would anyone do this?" And another wrote, "That's so cruel. I can't believe they actually cut you out." And slowly, like a spark catching on dry grass, the story spread. More people began sharing, not just my friends, but strangers. Strangers who knew nothing of me, but who recognized the injustice immediately. Strangers who understood the pain of being silenced, overlooked, erased. Encouraged, I posted more comparisons. The graduation photo where my sister was dressed in the gown that had once sagged on my shoulders, contrasted with the original portrait from the studio that showed my nervous but proud smile. The fishing trip where my brother suddenly held the line that I had pulled in with my aching arms, beside the untouched version with my small hands clutching the rod as the fish hung heavy before me. Each post was like another stone hurled through the carefully constructed glass house of lies my family had built, and soon cracks began to form, spiderwebbing across their facade of perfection. My siblings reacted quickly, posting online that I was bitter, unstable, obsessed with attention, but their words were drowned out by the images that spoke louder than anything they could claim. My parents sent me furious messages warning me to take everything down, warning me about family reputation and airing dirty laundry, as though they hadn't already soiled every fiber of my existence. as though their reputation mattered more than the fact that they had stolen my life from me. But I refused to stop. The more they pushed, the more determined I became, and soon my story was everywhere. Blogs picked it up. People wrote long threads about the daughter erased from history. Commentators debated whether it was an extreme case of favoritism or something darker. And for the first time in my life, I was no longer invisible. I was seen, heard, recognized. The silence that had always suffocated me, the suffocating weight of being the forgotten one, was gone, replaced by voices echoing my own. Voices reminding me that I was not alone, that I was not crazy, that I mattered. One evening, after another long day of fielding both support and backlash, my phone rang, and when I answered, it was my mother's voice, trembling and broken in a way I had never heard before. "Why are you doing this to us?" she asked, her words wet with tears, but instead of softening me, they only ignited the fire deeper in my chest. Because she still didn't get it. She thought this was about punishing them, about destroying them, when in reality, it was about saving myself. "I'm not doing this to you," I said, my voice steady, stronger than I had ever heard it. "I'm doing this for me. You wanted to erase me. You wanted to pretend I didn't exist. But now the whole world knows I was here. I existed, and nothing you do can ever take that away." There was silence on the other end, broken only by her ragged breathing, and for the first time, I didn't feel the desperate need to fill it. Didn't feel the urge to beg for her understanding or her love. I didn't need it anymore. That night, I pinned the final piece of proof to my wall, the original birthday photo. Me in the center, pink crown crooked on my head, cake frosting smeared across my nose, laughter frozen forever on my lips. And I sat before it for a long time, tears streaming down my face, but they weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of release, of liberation, because at last I was real again. At last, the ghost of a daughter they had tried so hard to bury was alive, breathing, undeniable. And as I looked at that photograph, glowing softly under the lamplight, I made myself one last vow. Never again would I allow anyone, family or otherwise, to cut me out of my own story. I had proof. I had a voice. I had myself. And this time, I would never let anyone erase me.